Betrayal and denial, two painful moments on the road to the cross. In this episode, we see Judas's fateful kiss and Peter's heartbreaking denial. What do these moments reveal about the human heart and the grace of Christ? Join Steve and Tim as they unpack the weight of these encounters and their significance in the journey to Calvary. This is episode 6, The Kiss of Death.
Well, welcome back. We are back in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's not an easy word to say. But
moving along.
Yes.
Not in the same location.
Not in the same location. All right. If you haven't followed, if you're jumping in right now, I'd encourage you maybe head back and just get to this point. I mean, we're 6 episodes in here, but you mentioned a couple weeks ago. Now things are really starting to pick up their pace in terms of the this road to the cross and how quickly we start moving through events. So, what do you got for us today?
We've got more momentum, more, I would say, acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
We've got an awful lot happening in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
So today I want to talk about the actual arrest of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I said last week, as we talked, that in the garden as he prayed, not my will, but thine be done, etc. I said we had the clearest example of Jesus' humanity.
Yeah.
And we have to be so careful, we talked about that last week, of reading and not either ignoring his humanity or his divinity.
Yeah, because both of those things were fully the case at all times.
100% and 100%.
Yeah, and you even talked about some heresies that have happened through history where they lean too much towards one and really suppress almost the truth of the other, of either his full divinity or his full humanity.
Yeah. So that's kind of the background. He genuinely feels in the garden all the emotions that all humans feel. He knows he's facing incredible danger.
Yeah.
He knows what's going to happen, but he doesn't know it in a detached way. Yeah. He's completely involved with it.
Well, and I would challenge one thing you just said in terms of he is fully experiencing something that every human experiences, except that most of us actually will never be in the place that he was. So even for us to put ourselves into his shoes, try to understand his emotional space, most Christians probably not actually ever going to face death in that way, knowing that it's coming and the brutal violence that's coming his way.
That's true. And as we spent a lot of time the last 2 episodes, it wasn't just even the physical stuff. There was this incredible pressing down by the powers of darkness. Yeah. But what I meant was we have to be so careful never to think, well, he's Jesus. He wasn't afraid.
Yeah.
He knew he was going to be resurrected. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
That he feels all those things that are, he feels them in a very big way. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't bypass any of our experience. Yeah. Okay? Yep. We talked some of that last time. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that's interesting, he comes out of this episode of praying, and Luke says even his sweat became like drops of blood. He comes out, his 3 closest friends are sleeping, and yet what we're going to see here, he doesn't come out weak and, this is terrible. He comes out strengthened, I think, by this trial.
Wow.
I think something got solidified in him. So we're going to mainly be drawing from Matthew's account. I've always loved Matthew 26 especially, but 26 and 27. We'll look a little bit at what John has to say, but largely out of Matthew. So I'm going to read just a few verses here. Matthew 26, verses 45 and 46. So he comes out of this incredible trial, and everybody's letting him down already, and he knows what's coming. But listen to this. He says, "The hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, Let's get going. Look, my betrayer is at hand. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So he came fully prepared, without any doubts. He resolutely steps into the ultimate spiritual battle. In John's telling, he recognizes, as he always does, the setting, the significance of the setting. And what do we have again? Darkness. Yeah. Darkness. His betrayal happened at night. Jesus, 3 years earlier, had already prophesied that this was going to happen in darkness. He says, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. Again, we've just got this setting of darkness. Yeah. Well, let's move at verse 48, Judas' kiss. And I kind of dangled something there at the end last time.
Yeah.
Now the betrayer had given them a sign. That means the soldiers and the mob that were with him. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. And at once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. So, and that's, I told you last week, it's from this episode that we get the expression, the kiss of death, not from the mafia.
Yeah, that was news to me. Yeah.
But it's this. So what did Judas's kiss mean? There's two very different interpretations that have been presented from the beginning. Almost universally, the church fathers saw Judas' kiss as a shameless act of betrayal. Ambrose saw it as the height of hypocrisy. He said, "Do you, a servant, betray your Lord, a disciple, his master, a chosen one, the Creator?" They all focus on the meekness of Jesus in not fighting back or even in rebuking Jesus. That seems obvious. But I think I want to shade this a little bit, because there may be a second meaning that gets lost in our English translation because we just got one word, kiss.
Yeah.
All three synoptics, however, use the much less common Greek word for kiss, kataphileo, and it means this: to kiss tenderly, to kiss again and again. We see that in the parable of the prodigal son. It means to kiss earnestly. It's a much stronger word than the more common word for kiss, and it denotes great, even passionate love. The Luke 7, the immoral woman is kissing his feet. When
that almost seems obscene to me, that what you just, like, comparing this kiss to that episode. Like,
yeah.
I'm offended.
Good. Well, that means you're awake. And I'm gonna take us through that.
All right.
But I did get your attention.
You absolutely did.
Hey, I should start making parables because they always were meant to offend and wake people
indeed.
up. But here's something I was reading, I think just this morning or yesterday or something, that she kissed him with this kataphileo kiss. Mm-hmm. But then afterwards, when Simon, the Pharisee, he's kind of offended by all this, Jesus said, "You didn't even greet me with a kiss," and she has not stopped kissing. "Simon, you didn't even greet me with just that perfunctory, that just social kiss."
This is a handshake effectively. Yeah.
The social kiss.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a strong, strong word. It's how the Father kissed his Son. So this is what I've been thinking about for a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. Did Judas genuinely love Jesus, even at the point of betrayal? The depth of his remorse just hours later, right? We'll talk about that a little later on today. Mm-hmm. I think it may reveal the depth of his love. Stay with me. It is possible that Judas was trying to force Jesus' hand simply because he thought, "Jesus, you're making a mistake. We need to be more active."
Yeah.
Remember, I'm just suddenly thinking of this. You'll remember, back in the difference between when I was a boy, Malcolm X and Dr. King.
Yeah.
And Malcolm X started to say, after a while, "Dr. King, you're making a mistake. This being nonviolent isn't getting us anywhere. We need to, and then that led to the whole Black Power thing. I just thought of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think maybe
Yeah.
with this kiss, we don't have somebody who's given up on Jesus, but who still loves him, but he's trying to force Jesus' hand because
he's getting out of the plan, ahead of the plan.
Yeah, because he figured Jesus wouldn't allow himself to be arrested, right? When he comes to kiss him, he's not going to allow himself to be arrested. Well, what did he do?
Mm-hmm.
So the rebellion, he wanted to launch a rebellion. He wanted, maybe. Mm-hmm. He wasn't getting rid of Jesus. I don't think it even occurred to him that this was all going to happen. That's why he threw the money down. We're going to talk about that later too. But because he just thought, well, Jesus isn't going to let this happen. I'm just moving things along. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, and we know, I mean, we have other accounts from the Gospels in terms of the disciples thinking in this way, right? I mean, the classic get behind me, Satan moment is when Peter says, whoa, ain't no way we're letting this happen to you, sort of a thing, as Jesus announces once again his betrayal.
'Cause surely it's not an accident that the synoptics all say he kissed him with this warm cataphileo kiss.
It's bizarre.
Because that's not a very common word.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. If you understand God, then he isn't God. So there's another thing I want us to observe in this exchange. Over the 3 years, Jesus has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger for the disciples. We've talked about that before, you know, a deliverer, a healer, the elements. But so they made the transition. They started by following a rabbi, a great teacher. But over 3 years, they understood the Christ, the Son of the living God. When he's in the upper room, which we looked at a few weeks ago, and he said, somebody's going to betray me tonight. They went around and they looked at him and they said, surely not I, Lord. Not I, Lord. But Judas never made that journey with Jesus. So what does he do when he comes to kiss him? He says, hail, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Really important that he refers to him as rabbi or teacher rather than Lord.
Respected, but not, So let's look at Jesus' response for a moment. He was fully aware of what was happening and who it was in front of him, who he just spent 3 years with, who was betraying him. Chrysostom is, again, the church fathers just were appalled by Judas and his behavior, right? And so they were all on option A, door number one.
Yeah.
And he said this, and although Jesus knew Judas' wickedness, he bore with him to the last hour and thrust not away the traitor, but even kissed him. In fact, Chrysostom's making an assumption because it doesn't specifically say that Jesus kissed him back. Jesus didn't feel anger in the midst of betrayal, but deep sadness, knowing what was about to happen to Judas. Someone he loved.
Yeah.
He says, friend, right? Yeah. Friend, why have you come? In Luke, he says, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? I think Jesus was still trying to turn Judas back from what he was doing. I think he was grieved and in a sense, pitying Judas. Like, don't do this for your sake. Not for mine, but for your sake.
Because he knows where it's going.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail you, and we gotta watch our time. But what you just said actually hit me in a new way. We've talked many times in this podcast, and you and I just over the years, in terms of what you've taught us all about Jesus' response to this entire passion play of he did not fight back.
Yep.
But you just used a word that I personally have not noticed or heard before in this context, which was anger. Like, he didn't get angry. And that's, for me, has just hit really hard today because we actually read in Paul's writing a little bit about the anger of God and the wrath of God, and the Greek word orgi or gay. I don't know.
It's easy for you to say.
Yeah, exactly. But again, we say it all the time, but writer to the Hebrews said Jesus is the exact imprint of God. If we want to understand God, we look to Jesus. Jesus in this moment, he's not even, it's not even a withholding anger, like he's angry, but he's not going to just take all these guys out. You're pointing out here that Jesus, even just his emotional response, is not one of anger.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I did say last week, in his full humanity, he's absolutely capable of anger. Remember, we used the example of the disciples and the little children.
Mm-hmm.
But he was, whenever he got angry, it was over injustice toward others, never himself.
The one that I think about most often, the obvious example of Jesus getting angry, of course, is the episode in the temple where he starts turning over the tables and all those things, because it is religious leaders who are supposed to be shepherds, who are supposed to be the ones caring for their people, and instead they have twisted the entire religious system to take advantage of the poor. Those are the things that make Jesus angry, and yet our betrayal of a holy God in this moment, that's who Jesus is, he is a holy God. Betrayal of a holy God in this moment brings him to a point of pain because he sees the trajectory that Judas is on. It does not bring him to a point of anger and wrath.
Yes.
Man, okay. That's good. Wow.
This teaches us to love and even pity those who seek to do us harm. Chrysostom, again, it's just, I broke down a longer passage. Who is there he would not have softened, and therefore do not hate, but bewail and pity him that plots against you, for such a one needs pity at our hands and tears. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, I think. Let's move on to the actual arrest. We get different variations from the four writers, but pretty likely, the most likely is that the soldiers who came were not Roman soldiers, they were the temple guard. These were Jewish soldiers. And in fact, it was a very prestigious position to have. And often, I was surprised when I learned this, they were often relatives of the high priest.
Oh.
It's not what you know, it's who you know.
Indeed.
Right? A Roman legion, I don't think it was Roman soldiers. That would have been too obvious. Because why is it happening at night? Because the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, want to slip this one in. They want to get it by the crowd because so much of the crowd is, up until that moment, is still saying, well, he is Messiah.
Indeed.
So
it was only a few days ago that they're shouting Hosanna as he's coming in. So it would be politically imprudent to be making this arrest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And because of their support, but also so easy to say, oh, it's the Romans, it's just, and then we're going to fight back, and they don't want them to fight back against the Romans. Their position depends on the Romans.
Yeah.
We're going to get into Annas and Caiaphas next week, and these really were bad guys, way worse than I thought before I started really studying this. Anyway, getting back to this, the Jewish leaders wanted Jesus arrested as quietly as possible. That's why they came at night. That's why they came to a remote location up on the Mount of Olives. Now, John tells the story, as always, with a little bit of a different perspective. John reports that when the crowd, the soldiers, asked if he was Jesus of Nazareth, he answered, I am. That's the actual Greek. We put in the other word, but it's I am. Immediately, all the soldiers fall to the ground, right?
Indeed. Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
But here's a little interesting thing when John puts it in. Because have you ever noticed he puts stuff in for a reason?
I read that somewhere.
Yeah. In the temple, when the sacred name was pronounced, which was only once a year at Yom Kippur, I am, Yahweh. The Jews would fall to the ground and prostrate themselves.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? I Hope I said prostrate themselves.
Tricky word.
Jesus or Christ was not identifying himself when they said, "Who's Jesus of Nazareth?" But he was identifying himself as the eternal Son of God.
The one who first identified himself from the burning bush.
Yes,
and
revealed to
introduced
Moses.
himself.
Yep, that's it. That's it. Jesus was in full control of what was going on. That's what John's trying to say too, right? All of this stuff, he's not angry. He's not in complete control. I am. And down they go. But it's interesting, the connection when the name of the Holy One is said once a year.
Wow.
Not because they fell over, but that's what you had to do.
That was the religious practice. Yeah. And here, presumably, they're not doing that because, that's the trigger word, we all got to hit the deck. Rather than...
It was the power and the presence of God. Yeah. And this was all part of him yielding himself up. This is all part of what we'll talk later more about, but this kenosis. He didn't fight back. He didn't even get angry. We're going to see in a few minutes he wouldn't let his disciples fight back. Verse 47, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs and the chief priests and the elders. John says, so Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. As I said, these were the temple guard, but this was a dangerous, angry, forceful crowd. Okay,
I've never quite understood the relationship between the Sanhedrin or the temple or what have you and the Romans. It seems interesting. For me, I struggle to understand why the Romans would even honor an arrest made by a different authority. If the temple guard was who showed up rather than the Roman soldiers, why does Rome feel obligated?
We're going to find out that they didn't feel obligated, and this take us into next week. Thanks for the lead. There was such a delicate relationship. They were an occupying force. Pilate was responsible. He actually was for 12 years. He was the governor. Normally it was 2 years. So he knew what he was doing. But he walked this fine line. They got to be in control, but there can't be rebellion. He gets in huge trouble if there's rebellion.
Yeah, gotcha.
Okay?
Yep.
So let's go verses 51 to 54. How about you read that? Jesus condemns violence.
Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen this way?"
These disciples are still there. And they have said at different times, you can count on us. Nobody said it louder than Peter. We'll get to that. But at this point, Jesus is saying, stop fighting. Stop it. So in the Beatitudes, and remember I wrote a book a few years ago on the Beatitudes for a time of crisis. I feel like many ways the crisis is coming right back around again. One of those 8 Beatitudes is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Here Jesus is personifying, is actualizing his teaching. Peacemakers really do call out to both sides, stop it. They don't take sides, they say,
They stand right in the middle.
They stand in the middle.
Yeah.
I remember a young lady, she's not young anymore, but she was a student of mine back in my days of being principal. And 10 years later, she was standing in Iraq, at the Iraq border, with some others, taking a stand to stop the tanks from coming in, to stop the killing. Wow. She wasn't pro-Iraqi. She wasn't pro-U.S. She was saying, stop. And yes, they didn't stop.
Yeah.
But she was taking a stand. I had great respect for her.
Yeah, and taking a stand, taking action right in the middle. I love that picture. That's different from being a peacekeeper.
Yeah.
Because he calls us to be a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper.
Yeah. Peacekeepers, what do we got to do to keep the peace?
Yeah.
Where do we compromise?
Yeah.
And I think that we see Jesus right here. He's saying, stop it.
Yeah. Can I do a plug for your book? I actually
sure.
heard you were going to talk that. So if you're watching on video, I'm holding the book. And if you're not, just imagine, if you will, a book called The Beatitudes for a Time of Crisis. That's a nice cover, by the way. I don't know who designed that.
I know who designed it.
This book came out kind of in the height of the pandemic, if I recall, and looks in depth at this and, of course, each of the Beatitudes, chapter by chapter. And in fact, some of them, you had so much to say you had to do 2 chapters on. I see that right here on Blessed are the Merciful, part 1, and I'm guessing part 2 came right after that.
It did. I thought it would be better than the other way around.
Indeed. But really excellent. If the Beatitudes is something you want to dig deeper into, I would encourage you to grab this. You can just get it on Amazon or at impactnations.com, either way, but the Beatitudes for a Time of Crisis. The other thing I want to say, actually, is I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few weeks because you've referenced Matthew's account of these events on many occasions, and we've got a particular focus this time around. But you did a full season in season 5 on the book of Matthew.
Our longest one ever.
Our longest one ever. It was, if you got a spare 55 hours, that's the one for you. But yeah, if any of this stuff particularly hits you and you want to go even deeper on this stuff, I would encourage you to go back to season 5 and look at some of the teaching for Matthew.
Because sometimes we did it just phrase by phrase.
Yeah.
Okay. When we're afraid, especially, which is so instinctive, it's just built into our DNA. And when we're angry, it leads us to violence, right?
Yeah.
We get angry, kids suddenly, a kid will punch another kid because he just got angry. He didn't think, I'm going to get that. It's instinctive.
Yeah.
Peter, though he's surrounded by a mob, big mob, he lashed out with his sword and he cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus' response was immediate. He says, Peter, put your sword back. What are you doing? Oy vey.
Oy vey. Peter again with the...
again with the sword. I thought we talked about this. Yeah.
All right, but this begs the question, though. Didn't he tell him to bring the swords? I seem to recall at some point.
And we are going there right now.
All right.
Thank you. We're going to look at Luke's account.
See, I set him up, he knocks him down.
And I have had people reference that to me when I talk about blessed are the peacemakers and nonviolence.
Mm-hmm.
Some point to Luke's account where Jesus tells the disciples to bring a sword. They say, okay, Master, we got 2. He says, that's enough.
2, that should do it against the sword.
And they see it as an indication that he was in favor of armed resistance in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
But if we would read it in context, he was telling them to do this as a fulfillment of that key messianic passage in Isaiah 53, right? Which says he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Okay? He was, okay, we're going to have a sword. They're going to think we're transgressors. And I think logically, having 2 swords against a whole mob with swords, clubs, whatever else they got, wouldn't help anything.
It's kind of bring a knife to a gunfight.
And the swords were not for self-defense. By the disciples being armed, Jesus would be treated as a criminal. You get it?
Yeah.
Jesus not only put a stop to the violence, he then healed the servant's ear, right? Yeah. Malchus, we're told his name is. So let me read a little bit from the Beatitudes.
Ooh, there we go.
For a time of crisis. This entire episode recorded by Matthew is filled with irony. The crowd, egged on by the religious leaders, were coming against the Prince of Peace. How? with swords and with clubs, the Prince of Peace, right? When Jesus told Peter to put his sword away, he was saying, this is not how we operate. We operate by the kingdom of God, not by their system. Man, if we could get a plaque that was at the front door of every church in the West.
Yeah.
This is not how we operate. We operate by the kingdom of God, not by their system. Excuse me. Jesus then stated clearly the testimony of history. All who draw the sword shall die by the sword. I've taught several times over the years, redemptive violence is a myth. Yeah. Redemptive violence says, well, if I just use a little violence, we can get some proper justice and some godly results. It is a myth. It does not redeem. Jesus is saying, I could fight force with force, but my way is never like that. I have come to put an end to violence. Jesus went the whole distance with this. He never fought back. We follow the one, and you mentioned this earlier, we follow the one who chose to die rather than fight back. The cross confronts the systems of the world that say, well, this is just how it is. The cross says, no, it isn't. So now the disciples, imagine, I'm going to protect him, and, oh, this is worse than I thought, and we can't even fight back. Yeah. They don't know. Just the crisis that must have gone on in them. So they're watching hopelessly. They vowed to protect him, and now he was protecting them. Isn't that interesting? I told you that I am he. I'm back in John. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking for me, let these people go. This was to fulfill the word that he'd spoken. I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me. That's John 18:6-9. They recognized that this was their chance to escape. If they're going to get going, they better do it now, in the dark. And they fled into the darkness. It kind of hit me, the irony of this. 3 years earlier, they left everything to follow him. Now they're leaving him. Let's look at Peter's denial. It's such a famous episode. It's famous even beyond Christianity, I think. There's a remarkable consistency in the 4 gospel accounts of Peter's denial. When you get such consistency, it surprises me, actually. Matthew was written to the Antioch church. Mark was written from Peter's telling and probably to the Roman church.
Which I've often noticed that Mark's gospel actually has the most kind of disparaging Peter oy vey sort of moments, and I think it's because Peter's actually he's giving him permission to he's telling the story.
He's telling the story. In Matthew, Peter comes out of the boat.
Yeah.
In Mark, no. Luke, his version of this was from what he learned from Paul. John, a whole generation later, and he was writing from Ephesus. So there's virtually no differences in the narrative at all. We have a long passage. I'm going to get you to do me the favor. Matthew 26:69-75.
Yeah. And here you left off the narrative a moment ago just with all of the disciples scattering.
Yeah.
But it would seem from this that they didn't go too far. They obviously were disappeared into the woods perhaps, and then followed to see what's going to happen next, because that's where we find Peter, as he's not far away.
At least 2 of them, John and Peter.
Here we go, starting in verse 69 of Matthew 26. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Okay. I'm going to highlight a few things rather than, explain it. We know this passage pretty well. Peter is standing outside of Caiaphas's house. He's the high priest. And we learned from John that John had some family connections enough that he was allowed in. So Peter gets to come in. We're going to look at it next week. This was the Jewish interrogation and then the Roman. I want you to see, because once again, as we've said in seasons past, Matthew, like John, structures, like all four of them, structures. What he includes is very purposeful. There's two trials going on at once. There's the trial of Jesus' messiahship, and there's the trial of Peter's discipleship. Okay? Jesus is confronted by verbal threats here, and we'll get more of that next week, but he is confronted by verbal threats 3 times. Peter is tested by verbal statements 3 times that are very threatening to him. When Jewish leaders taunt him with, prophesy to us if you're Messiah, Peter's denial that's happening some yards away, Peter's denial is the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. Because only a few hours earlier, Jesus told the disciples they would all desert him, which they had. And Peter, confident in himself, said, though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, Peter, this very night before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Peter said, of course, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. Well, one thing here, subjectively, our best intentions, our determination to do right are not enough to free us from ourselves, right? With enough fear, with enough anger. While he's at the fireside there, his heart is on trial. And Matthew tells this in 3 escalating episodes. And with each of them, there's more and more pressure building on Peter, who said, I'm not going to crack. You can count on me. Number 1, a simple servant girl challenges him.
Yeah.
He says, no. Now, the next episode, she goes and appeals to the other bystanders of seeing what's going on. And so now they say that when she does that, he says, no, it's not true. And then thirdly, from a whole group of bystanders, now the pressure's really on him, and they confront him. As Peter is denying Jesus by stages, there's actually a physical distancing going on. The first denial, he's as close as he's going to be to Jesus by the fire in the courtyard. And then Matthew tells us he backs up to the gate. And then he finally escapes outside the gate, and that's where the final accusation from the crowd is. So each time his denial gets stronger and stronger, and he physically gets further and further from Jesus.
This is fascinating, because I was just talking with a friend this morning about the ministry of reconciliation. We were looking at Colossians 1:19, where he's reconciled all things to himself, and we were once verse 21, I think, we were once enemies of God or whatever. And I was talking about how that's us distancing ourselves from him. It's us again and again turning away from him. It's not him pushing us away further. It's our sin continues to distance us. He's not moving. It's us.
Yeah, exactly.
And here we see that.
Got a picture
physically
of it right
here. Yeah, amazing.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And then just to remember the verse 75, then Peter remembered. All of a sudden he remembered what Jesus had said before the cock crows, you deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. St. Augustine said this, to wash away the sin of denial, Peter needed the baptism of tears. Isn't that good?
Yeah.
So I want us to try to picture Peter. Again, I've said to you the last 2-3 episodes, this whole thing starting up on the mountain, this whole thing plays out like a movie in front of me. Now picture him, he is realizing what happened. He's weeping and running as hard as he can, but he can't run away from himself.
Yeah.
He can't get any relief by running. He's confronted head on with his failure. There's no way around it. So as the dawn is beginning to break, some of the church fathers talk about this. Increasingly, what happens? Remember at Gabriola, our beloved Gabriola Island, what happens is it's starting to get closer to dawn. Those cotton-picking roosters start, right?
Absolutely.
They do.
Yeah.
And that's what they do. That's their job, right? They get paid minimum wage, but they do it. So as he's running, weeping, broken, shattered, can't get away from himself, increasingly more and more, the cock crows. Early church tradition says that for the rest of his life, Peter could never hear a rooster crow without weeping. This episode marked Peter for the rest of his life. It comes out in his writing. It comes out in those writing about him. As the preeminent disciple in the early church, as surely he was, as the one whose sermon on Pentecost inaugurated the church, as the one who first opened the gospel to the Gentiles. Remember when he went to the centurion? As the one who followed Jesus even to his own crucifixion in Rome, AD 66, probably maybe 67. And he's crucified upside down. He says, I'm not worthy to be crucified.
Where do we get that, by the way? Because
tradition. It's just verbal. They knew it. The church in Rome knew it. They kept it alive.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that. And yet through it all, he never forgot his failure. He was so aware of his failure as he stood up, breathed upon and empowered by the Holy Spirit, and he preached the Pentecost sermon.
Yeah.
So in his failure, he discovered the depth of God's grace and forgiveness. It's in failure we discover his grace. Yeah. And one of my favorite passages, there's a similar one in Psalm 51, but in Isaiah 57, for thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in a high and holy place, and also with those who are contrite and humble in spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite. No contrition, no humility, no revival.
Yeah.
It can't be revived. It's all about the grace, right? Yeah. We talked about forgiveness many times. Yeah. He doesn't say, I won't forgive you. He says, you can't be forgiven if you're out of where I am, stepped away from me.
How can you receive something if you're unaware of your need for it?
So his failure did not disqualify Peter, but he never forgot it. He never brushed it off. And as I have told you and your brothers since you were teens, there'll come a time when you'll begin to follow a person, a leader, a spiritual leader. Make sure you follow someone who walks with a limp, right? And I know you now share that with others. And if you're going to listen to prophecy, prophetic utterance, listen for the sound of tears in his or her voice. It's the same principle. Yeah. Okay, so St. Gregory asks, why did God allow Peter to fail like this? And he says, this we know was a great dispensation of the divine mercy, so that he who was to be the shepherd of the church might learn through his own fall to have compassion on others. God, therefore, first shows him to himself and then places him over others to learn through his own weakness how to bear mercifully with the weakness of others. That's why I listen for tears and I follow people who walk with a limp.
It's almost like that was a prerequisite. I mean, St. Gregory says it here, really. Like Peter was to be the father of the church. It was like a prerequisite. You've got to you've got to have been to this place of being so acutely aware in such a way that it's reminding you quite regularly of your need for His grace.
Yes.
That's absolutely beautiful, and I even wonder if that's why when Peter gets a chance to help with Mark's help write his gospel, he keeps on putting that stuff in there, like, hey, just remember, this is where the guy who is now the big cheese, this is where he comes from. This is how often he stuck his foot in his mouth, how often he stepped away, distanced himself from his Lord and Savior. That's amazing. Wow. And I think instructional for us as leaders too, by the way, is to not ever pretend like you've got it all together. We've got to actually even tell others where we've come from in terms of experiencing God's grace.
We go back to what we were saying a little while ago, what Jesus is saying. We follow the kingdom of heaven, not the world. And the world is always trying to protect itself, cover its backside, always. Making excuses, projecting to somebody else, trying to look as good as we can. And he says that is not the way the kingdom of God works. And we need to take hold of that, as Peter did, again and again and again, especially as God gives us some authority or some grace to lead the way with some folks. We got to lead with a limp and with honesty. You see, the enemy always works in darkness, right? We're back to the metaphor of this being nighttime. What's darkness? It's covering up, right? He who says he has no sin, 1 John 1:8, he's deceived. But he who walks in the light, we're called to walk in the light. And if I'm going to walk in the light, how can I say I don't mess up? How can I say I don't get afraid? How can I say I don't get frustrated? You can't, even though we're in a world that tries to hold on to those lies, and look how well that's worked for the world.
I mean, even Paul, who wrote the better part of the New Testament, was the one who said, I am chief among sinners. Like, I'm as bad as it gets.
Yep. I'm actually going to finish with a little Paul quote. So we've just looked at Peter. Let's look for a few minutes, not too long, on the suicide of Judas. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I've betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. Now, only Matthew inserts this episode. Why did he do it? Well, I think he's comparing Peter's failure with Judas' treachery. Matthew shows that from long before, the Old Testament shows in remarkable detail the pattern of Judas' betrayal and his faith. Centuries before. Verse 4, Judas says to them, I've sinned, for I've betrayed innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. The Jewish leaders' response was, we don't care. Judas's guilt or innocence was irrelevant to them. They only cared what they could accomplish through Jesus' death. In fact, Jesus' death, I think, was irrelevant to them too. They were trying to manipulate society, trying to manipulate their position with Rome, all of that. So all they were doing was using Jesus, and now they don't care about Judas. They needed to use him 24 hours ago, but we don't need him now. And so they don't care. They discard. And we see so much of this, Tim, in our modern world, in the business world. We see it. I'm sad to say we see it sometimes in the church world. We see it in the political realm, where everybody's a commodity. And again, Jesus said, this shall not be so with you. Whether Jesus' claims about being the Messiah were right or wrong, whether he was sent by God or not, did not matter to them. He was an annoyance. He was a hindrance. He was a problem that needed to be dealt with. Matthew uses the Greek word for regret. Judas' regret rather than metanoia, repentance. Matthew seems to be contrasting Peter's brokenness with Judas' despair. A broken heart seeks forgiveness in the midst of its pain. It's sorry, but it wants to be healed and forgiven and reconciled. It believes in the mercy of God. It believes in the mercy of God. I don't think Peter ever stopped believing in the mercy of God. He just felt so sorry for what he'd done. But a despairing heart does not hold any hope. And yet, Judas, this whole episode is not treated in a light or trivial way, because he doesn't say, oh, I made a mistake. He confesses, I have sinned. That's the difference in Psalm 51 with David. It's not, I did something wrong, I made a mistake. I have sinned. Okay? Judas does not blame others. I have sinned, but there was all this pressure.
The Sanhedrin made me do it. Or
Da-da-da-da-da. Yeah. Judas declares that Jesus is innocent. So I got a question and I don't have an answer. Is anyone beyond the reach of God's forgiveness and grace? In the context of Judas, the greatest betrayer in history. When Judas threw the coins down, did he believe that he could reverse what he'd done? Well, here's a little interesting thing. In Jewish law, in any business transaction, there was a grace period. The seller could change his mind and return the money and get his property or whatever back. If a buyer hid in order not to have the sale canceled, right? Because wait a minute, I want to hold this. I don't want him to be able to come back. And they would do that. The seller could go to the temple and he could leave the purchase money there, and this would legally reverse the sale.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of what's going on. How many times have you and I said to each other, these are not cartoon characters. They're not two-dimensional. So whether it's the kiss, whether it's this, sometimes what seems obvious isn't maybe obvious. Mm-hmm. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, it is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money. Oh, weren't they righteous? So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. It is blood money. Their refusal to put the money in the treasury was acknowledgement of their own guilt, the guilt of murder.
Yeah.
Right? That was their acknowledgement. So obviously, Matthew meant this passage to be filled with irony. The Sanhedrin wants to maintain ritual purity in the use of blood money in the midst of their willingness to allow Jesus' innocent blood to be shed. Not just their willingness, their whole manipulation of everything. Their rage has blinded them to common sense. Have you noticed that elsewhere it says, well, we're not going to do this during the Passover lest it creates a great problem. And when do they do it? During the Passover. It's their rage, it's their anger that controls them. It says that they consulted together. Chrysostom again. They did not make these decisions randomly, but took counsel together. This indicates that no one is innocent of the deed. All are guilty. Matthew is consistent throughout the Passion account that we have all sinned and fallen short. Romans 3:23. Yeah. And the reach of this sin is going to rapidly in the next few hours expand outward and outward and outward and keep going. What happened here? He throws down the coins. What's that to us? They said, well, we can't, this is blood money. This is a very specific fulfillment of Zechariah 11, 12, and 13, written hundreds of years before. So they counted out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter.
To the potter.
This magnificent sum at which they valued me. So I took the 30 coins and threw them to the potter in the temple of the Lord. Wow. Not bad, huh?
Yeah.
So they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. That's verse 10. Blood money was unclean. According to Old Testament law, graveyards were unclean. Still today, a potter's field refers to a pauper's grave for those whose identity is not known, right? Pauper's field, they have them all over New York. That's where we don't know. Jane and John Doe go to the potter's field. One more time with Chrysostom. He had so much to say about this whole episode. If they had put the blood money into the treasury, their deed might have remained relatively hidden. But the religious leaders made clear their guilt to all subsequent generations by buying the piece of land for burial. They thereby unconsciously declare their guilt. So, for those who struggle with two different accounts, I'm just going to briefly go through this. Matthew is the only gospel that records Judas's suicide. And it clearly states that he died by hanging himself. Mm-hmm. But Luke tells us in Acts 1 that Judas died when he fell and his entrails burst out.
Thanks for that, Luke.
While some commentators work really hard to reconcile these two accounts, and I read some of them. I mean, they really do. Well, he hung, and eventually the rope robbed, and his body had rotted, and wow. If you're a literalist, you really got to do some hard work. Anyway, as we've seen so often, the gospel writers present details and episodes to fulfill their purpose in writing. Truth goes beyond facts, we've said many times. More than any others, Matthew presents Jesus as the Son of David, the fulfillment of God's Davidic promise. In light of this was really interesting. One theologian said that he thinks Judas could be seen as an Absalom figure who revolts and wants the kingdom to come, but on his own terms. And Absalom came to his end by hanging in a tree. Luke focuses more on the letting of blood. Remember his sweat like drops of blood. Likewise, Judas' blood is spilled in the field of blood. The potter's field he calls the field of blood, right? So the point is not to strive and stretch to bring harmony to these two differing accounts. It's to recognize the author's intent and to find his intent in the structure of each. Yeah. So let me wrap it up. How are we doing? Not bad.
Yeah.
The spiritual darkness through this whole episode we've covered today continues to increase. There's like a heaviness coming down. In the midst of the greatest betrayal ever, we see Jesus' unwavering love and grace. And in that, we see a foretaste or foreshadowing of his declaration that will come just some hours later. Father, forgive them. Forgive them all. Yeah. They don't know what they're doing. We've seen today that Jesus condemns violence, even in the midst of the greatest danger. Peter's denial is one of the most famous personal failures in history, and he never avoided or made excuses. We talked about that. But Paul, I thought, Paul, what did you have to say about weakness? Well, he had a lot to say, but I'm going to give you just one verse from 2 Corinthians. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in us. The Holy Spirit's power is truly revealed as I embrace the counterintuitiveness of being transparent. And that's what we covered today.
Yeah, fantastic.
Any other comments or questions?
Well, I mean, you laid out that question, just dangle it out there in terms of, let me just find it in your notes here, because is anyone beyond the reach of God's forgiveness and grace? Yeah. I would encourage folks, hey, why don't you have a good old debate in the comments on YouTube about that? Suicide, in some church traditions
Yes.
is really seen as a unpardonable sin, really.
Yeah.
Where did that? Do you know where that came from? I'm putting you on the spot now. It's
I don't
not a
know.
fair question.
I don't know
but-
how far back it goes, but it certainly goes back to medieval time in the church, which then
Yeah.
was just the Catholic Church, and that suicides could not be buried in sanctified ground. In other words, in a church
Yeah.
graveyard.
Yeah.
Where it started, I'm not sure. If you want to ask me, because you probably do, I absolutely do not believe suicide is the unpardonable sin.
And I think that.
But it's a tragedy.
It's an absolute tragedy. But I think that thinking is shifting on that. I think in the church. I think the church, and you mentioned this, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, about denying denying depression
Mental
and
illness.
mental illness and things like that, and denying people the ability to go find medication for it and things like that.
Yeah.
I think that really the church is evolving and growing in that sense, and recognizing that it's an illness the same as heart disease is or whatever. And so I think that helps.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we have listeners who have lost a loved one because mental illness gripped them and they reached the point of despair that they took their own life. What would you say to comfort those who are in that time, who have been left behind by a loved one who decided to take their life?
What would you say?
Oh, that's. I personally, I'm of the belief that their despair may have taken him in that moment, but does not disqualify them from fully experiencing God's love and grace, and that He is absolutely waiting for them on the other side to welcome them. And when they meet Jesus, when they reach that place of full revelation of His goodness and of His glory, they also are fully restored to the place of bearing His image and recognizing that anything that led them to that choice was deception. It was not recognizing who they truly are in Christ. And they have now reached a place of finally getting, this is who I am. This is who Jesus says I am. This is who God the Father says I am. And rejoice in the fact that they have full revelation of Him, but also full revelation of who He made them to be.
I suddenly remembering a verse, Jeremiah 5, it might be verse 5. Heal me and I will be healed. I love that verse because that's what you're talking about. Everything's going to be healed.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be healed. And so I would be I think you just said it more eloquently than I would have, but that's what I believe. His mercy endures for quite a while.
That's the Steve Stewart version. Yeah. Quite a while. That's fairly interesting. Folks, I hope that this is, we went places I didn't know we were going to go today. This is wonderful. Thank you for taking us on this journey. Thanks for letting me interrupt you and get us sidetracked and down some rabbit holes as well. But friends, I hope that this is just taking you deeper and deeper into this passion play, because there is so much waiting for us there. Hey, if you yourself have encountered just received some revelation from the Holy Spirit as you've wrestled with some of these texts over the years, let us know. Send us an email right in the comments. We see all of those. I love it. Engage with one another. Again, as always, I say share this episode with somebody if this was helpful. Church leaders, even business leaders, things like that. There was so much wisdom to be gained from some of what you said today. So don't miss that stuff and share it with other leaders. Leaders hang out with other leaders, and you may know some folks that need to hear this.
Let me say one more thing.
Yeah.
I just looked over at the book. You can pick it up again. There you go. Shamefully marketing. The Beatitudes, it says in Amos, he gives the image of putting down a straight stick and a crooked stick. And the way you can tell it's crooked is because it doesn't line up with a straight stick. He talks about a plumb line. I believe the Beatitudes are a plumb line. They are not only Christ's biography, but they're almost like a litmus. Here I'm using all these various metaphors, a litmus test of leadership, of servant leadership, of righteousness in business, etc. The Beatitudes are worthy of a lifetime of study because Jesus gave them to us as a plumb line.
Yeah.
And he says, this plumb line brings you life.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the way of the kingdom.
Yeah. So if you're wondering what's good, what's bad, should I trust this person or that person? We can't judge people, but there's some, especially those who put themselves forward very publicly. Just look, how does it line up?
Yeah. Good. Next week?
Yeah, we're going to begin to look at the trial because he's been arrested and now he's being hauled off first to the former high priest who still holds tons of political power, Annas, and then to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. And then we're going to get ourselves eventually over to Pilate.
Brilliant. I'm excited. Going to learn some new things, folks. Tune in every Tuesday. No, not Tuesday, Thursday. Every Thursday, we put another episode on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. Do be sure to share this with other folks. Rate us on whatever your favorite podcast app is. It helps others discover who we are and what we're doing. And if you want to learn more about Impact Nations in general and how we are seeing his kingdom come, his will be done, as we minister to those who are on the margins, those who are oppressed at times violently. Check out impactnations.com and just do follow us on YouTube because we often put up some videos of lives transformed and stuff too. Thanks for being with us, and we will see you again next week. God bless.
Bye-bye.